I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and today we're out here in country Victoria to drive a pretty important new model for Holden. It's their first proper large SUV in quite some time. It's called the Acadia and it's essentially a GMC vehicle that's been sold in the United States for some time already. But the Acadia Down Under is not without its individualisation and customisation for the Australian market. And that's certainly not limited just to this lion badge on the front grille. This is the only place in the world where the Acadia doesn't wear the GMC badge, and that's because Holden's engineers have done a considerable amount of work fettling the Acadia under the metal, under the body, to make this car a better and more appropriate car to drive on our local Australian roads. However, there's no getting away from the fact that this is a very American SUV. It looks bold, it looks brash, pretty masculine. I actually think that it's quite a handsome vehicle because I like an SUV that's honest about being a large and fairly bulky vehicle. And there's also no getting away from the Americanism of the engine of this car. It's a big 3.6 litre petrol V6, no diesel available. Now, the Acadia is going to compete with real successors like the Mazda CX-9 and the Toyota Kluger. So this thing has to be pretty good in order to convince Australians that it's got what it takes, and also to convert a lot of people that weren't particularly happy with their Holden Captivas. So we're going to start inside the Acadia, check out the interior, the first, second and third row, and then we'll take this thing out for a drive to see if this really is a great SUV for Australia. The Acadia isn't Holden's first SUV that they've taken out of the American market. That honour was bestowed on the Equinox, which came out just under a year ago to replace the Captiva in 5-seat form. This Acadia is the 7-seat replacement, but I am pleased to report that the interior of the Acadia does actually take a big step up. I don't have the same sorts of concerns about material quality as I did with the Equinox, and most of the reason for that is that the Acadia hails from one of General Motors' slightly more premium brands in the US, where GMC ranks above Chevrolet, and you can tell that in the cabin of this new Holden. You get soft touch material in a more broad sense up here on the dash, on the doors, and the materials used for the seats also feels a little bit more lush and luxurious. Now, the Acadia is available in 3 different model grades, but actually none of them is that poorly specified. Even the base model gets this really nice 8-inch touchscreen, which runs GM's next generation infotainment. In fact, the 2019 Holden Acadia is the first car in the GM world to get this new infotainment software out of the box as standard. So all cars get the 8-inch screen, they got Apple CarPlay, Android Auto, and integrated navigation across the range, which is great. However, it is mounted quite low in this vehicle, so you do find yourself looking down a little bit. Mounting a little bit higher at eye level might be preferable for some. Now, the particular car we're in here is the LTZV, so you get absolutely all of the toys, including an additional 8-inch screen in front of you that's customizable for the driver. You also get really nice things for the Australian summer, like cooled seats and also a panoramic sunroof. But it's actually the mid-grade LTZ model that I think looks like fantastic value, because you get these really nice black leather seats as standard, heating on the LTZ, 10-way power adjustment for the driver. The passenger gets 8-way in the LTZ, 10-way in the LTZV. Plus, those 2 models get wireless phone charging as well, which is always nice to have. Now, space in the cabin feels really good. That's part of the positives of driving an American-sourced SUV. Built in Tennessee, this one, so there's a good feeling of space. You got big cup holders between the seats, you got heaps of room in the center console, lots of places to stash everyday clutter. The Acadia looks like it's going to make it pretty easy to fit a child seat because the doors open nice and wide and the roofline continues straight. It doesn't slope down like an SUV that's trying to ape coupe looks. Also, the doors have a nice thunk to them when they close. That sounds quality. And you also notice that there are soft touch materials here in the back as well, which is actually quite luxurious, and that's becoming a really rare feature in this segment, so that's good to see. In terms of the actual room on offer in the second row of the Acadia, it's good. So even where I'm sitting now, I've got about as much room as you'd expect from this car's rivals, but this seat is positioned where I would have enough space in the third row. So that gives you an idea of just how spacious this SUV is. If I wanted to, like if I wasn't expecting any friends to be sitting in the third row, you could put this seat all the way back and then you've just got acres of legroom. Headroom isn't a problem either. Shoulder room's pretty good. And Holden are saying that they think the Acadia LTZV is actually a decent replacement for the Caprice, which was their old extended wheelbase sedan, locally manufactured. And I can see that that does make sense, at least in terms of rear legroom, which is massive. In terms of other amenities, it's pretty good back here. All cars get tri-zone climate control, for example, and there are actually 5 USB ports, all of them high powered, so that people can actually use and charge iPads at the same time, which is good. You don't get that from just your bog standard USB port. Now, there are also things like a flip down armrest with 2 decent sized cup holders, which is always good to see, plus a little bit more storage in the doors as well. Access in the Acadia isn't ideal because they haven't managed to convert it to right-hand drive curb access. So instead, the small light seat is here on the right-hand side. It is still possible to clamber in from the left of the vehicle though, which is important in right-hand drive markets. What is really great is the space on offer in the third row. So you'll remember where I was sitting in the second row before with enough legroom. Here in the third row, this is the corresponding space. So I've still got an inch or 2 of legroom here. Headroom is fine, and you could easily fit 2 adults here in the back. So this is what they mean when they talk about a genuine 7-seater, which is really good to see. Plus you have dedicated air vents back here. Airbags cover the third row too, and there's a powered USB port for third row passengers. So all of that means this adds up to being a pretty comprehensive family car. Holden are very keen to emphasise that the Acadia is a proper 7-seater, and as we saw, the third row does have a decent amount of space, but also the boot is larger than its rivals. And that's despite this car actually being packaged into a slightly shorter body than something like a CX-9, which is actually an enormous car. Now, the boot of the Acadia, it's really logical because there's a really nice wide opening. It's very square, there's no load lip, so you can slide things straight in and out. And it looks like there's a really decent amount of space there. Holden tell us that it is more with 5 seats up than the Kluger or the CX-9, but that said, the measurement used for the Acadia's boot appears to go right up to the roof, whereas some competitors don't. So we'll project the correct literage here. But what the boot does have is a couple of special features. You do get a 12-volt socket here on the right, a little bit of underfloor storage, and you can actually fold that second row right from within the boot space itself. Plus, it's easy to fold up the third row. The seats themselves aren't actually too heavy, which is good. And even with 7 seats up in this car, there's still about 350 litres of space back here, which means that you can carry a full complement of people plus school bags in the back without a problem. So, what's the Acadia like to drive? Well, right from the get-go, it actually seems really convincing from behind the wheel, because although the recipe for this SUV is quite traditional and American, all the bits and bobs come together really nicely, and the dynamics of this SUV are actually really quite satisfying. So I'll get to the bits that the Australian teams were able to change shortly, but first of all, let's have a look at what Holden were given to work with from the GMC Acadia, and namely that was the engine, which goes unchanged between here and the United States. So in the US, you can get 2 engines in the GMC version, but here in Australia, we only get the 3.6 litre V6, which is the high-spec engine. Holden chose not to offer a 2.5 litre naturally aspirated 4-cylinder. Instead, we've got the big V6, which is essentially the same engine that you'll find in most grades of the ZB Holden Commodore, the new imported Commodore. And it produces 231 kilowatts of power and 367 newton meters of torque in the Acadia application. So certainly decent outputs if you consider that this is an Atmo engine. However, if you shop around, you will find that turbocharged rivals to this car offer more torque, and torque really is what you want when you're carrying around heavy loads, like a full complement of 7 people. That said, the V6 has plenty of power, particularly at the top end, And once you get the boot into it, this thing really does move, and it makes a really good sound while it does it as well. Initially, I was a bit worried about the Acadia's fuel economy. Big V6s like the Toyota Kluger and the old Mazda CX-9, they drank a lot of fuel. Downsizing and turbocharging has been a bit of a trend in order to get that sort of thing under control. But actually, the Holden Acadia's V6 doesn't use too much fuel. We've been out and about doing sort of spirited country touring, and I've seen around 10.5 litres per 100 kilometres on average. Don't know what the town economy is like yet. We'll have to wait until we can get an Acadia back onto Sydney roads in order to find out. But the economy out on country roads has been about the same as the Mazda CX-9, which uses a downsized, turbocharged 4-cylinder engine, so that's something interesting. The economy difference between the all-wheel drive and the front-wheel drive versions of this car, there's a difference on paper, but out on the road we haven't actually seen all that much of a difference. Speaking of the all-wheel drive system, it's a $4,000 option in the Acadia, but it's quite interesting because you can actually completely disengage the power going to that rear axle via a rotary dial here on the center console. So you can operate in pure front-wheel drive or a proactive all-wheel drive mode where it doesn't wait for a wheel to slip before it directs torque backwards. If you get on the throttle really hard or you start cornering aggressively, it automatically kicks in. The V6 engine is paired as standard to a 9-speed automatic gearbox, same one you'll find in the ZB Commodore, and the Australians have tuned that as well. Now, 9 is a lot of gears, and so the Acadia can tend to just hunt around a little bit some of the time for the right gear, but that said, because it has a lot to choose from, it's able to keep the V6 largely in its torque band. Just when it's caught out, there can be a delay as it rethinks the whole process. But what's really cool is that the sport mode, that's also standard in these cars, has all of the features you'll find on that ZB tuner, the gearbox, including performance mode lift foot, which is really cool. When you start driving a little bit more sportily and aggressively, it'll resist up changes, it'll downshift under harder braking, so it actually acts as quite an athletic gearbox. The one problem with it is that there's no paddle shifters. Instead, like, you get this weird Americanism of volume and track buttons on the back of the steering wheel, and the Tiptronic, what appears to be Tiptronic mode on the gear shifter itself, doesn't really work like that. Instead, the plus and minus buttons down here limit the highest gear that you can be in. That leads me on to the handling and the dynamics of the Acadia, and this is stuff that the Australian team were actually able to have an input with. Now, the level of Australian input isn't quite as much as the ZB Commodore, but we still were able to change a lot of aspects to the GMC version of this car. Now, that really depends on the suspension type, so the LT and the LTZ have passive dampers, and the LTZV has continuous damper control, the adaptive damper system. The adaptive dampers, that's a pure Australian tune. Our tune is completely different to the US. On the passively damped car, we do share the tune with the 2019 model year GMC Acadia, but that tune was done in a large part by Rob Trubiani, one of the big names of Holden's chassis engineering team here in Australia. That was done in the US by Rob and the GMC team in concert, and both parties were happy with the outcome. Interestingly, there's not a big difference in the ride quality between the passively damped car and the one with continuous damping. Instead, they've both kind of come out with a similar feel when you're going straight. They're both really, really compliant. This car has one of the best rides in the large SUV segment, deals with bumps well, but then where this differs to something like the Hyundai Santa Fe is that the Holden Acadia is also really nice and settled when the road turns smooth. The Hyundai doesn't really settle down all that well, but the Acadia is really plush and smooth on a good road surface, plus it can cop big imperfections as well. A great thing is that you don't suffer on the 20-inch wheels of the LTZV, and that's because of that continuous damper control. They've actually achieved a similar level of plushness to the smaller 18-inch wheels on the lower models. That said, there is just that little extra bit of compliance on the 18s, which actually don't look too small on this car, so I reckon you can get away without buying the really cool big wheels. The steering is pretty nice. That was done here in Australia for the Holden Acadia, and it's an all-Australian steering tune. Typically for Holden, it's quite light, which is good for a big car like this, and it's very direct. So as soon as you start moving the steering wheel, the front wheels turn. They were telling us that the GMC tune is a little bit heavier steering and less direct, whereas our tastes are a little different. One other final thing I'll say about safety is that the Acadia has a sophisticated traffic sign recognition system in the camera. It's really accurate. One thing though is that if you happen to exceed the speed limit by a small margin, it starts flashing at you in your peripheral vision, and that doesn't stop flashing at you until you get back under the speed limit. Now that's not something you can turn off. So if you're the kind of person that likes to cruise at say 118 in 110, you'll have the thing flashing at you the whole time. So those are my initial impressions of the new Holden Acadia. By no means is it an easy ride for Holden at the moment. There's a lot of anger out there about shutting down local production. Only a year has passed since then. But a possible recovery will be driven by good product, and the Acadia looks like it passes muster. It's sized right, the third row is big, the value equation isn't bad, and it's very good to drive, thanks in no small part to the very same people that made Australian Holdens so good in the first place. You'd be silly not to at least consider the Acadia against the Mazda CX-9 class of family cars.